Today I want to talk about showing depth in your painting when you're using a photograph that doesn't have much depth in it. Got a couple here that are a good example of that. It's a lot of distance here in the photograph. Obviously from the foreground way to the background there's a lot of distance, but the value change and the temperature change in the distance does not show that. What you want to do is push the idea of value and temperature change to make things recede. Now the first thing when using a photograph though, and even if you don't have a computer, if you're not using a computer, you still have to do this using a sketchbook, is to crop the painting or crop the photograph. So you can do a number of small quick thumbnail drawings where you decide what you can eliminate. Now the computer can do that a bit easier. I'm getting rid of things that just aren't that necessary. And you start with the idea of your focal point here, the church, and how far can you go out in the top, bottom, and the two sides and still have a lot going on. And this is more of a rectangular, almost a square composition. I could do a bit more of a horizontal, getting rid of some of the sky and a lot of the foreground, but not too much on the two sides. There we go. And it makes a pretty good long composition, horizontal composition. Now, what I want to change here, not only do I want to change the background to make these green trees bluer and also lighter, I also want to make the foreground, the darks, a little darker in here and make some of the lights in the foreground a lot brighter and stronger, warmer, make them come forward. So you have to push both ends. Cooler on the in the background and lighter, and darker and warmer in the foreground. Now when I say darker in the foreground, obviously there's some lights in the foreground, light shadows. But what I'm talking about is these dark accents can be darker. They're smaller in this case, and I can go in and push those a bit darker, and that makes them come forward. So the first thing is the background, kind of the middle background in there. I'm going to cool that off so you can see the difference. I'm taking that bluish, this is blue-green, ultramarine blue with maybe a touch of yellow ochre. Cad yellow is probably too strong for back in there. And I've also gotten rid of a lot of the detail, all the little dots and dashes of houses, bare ground, and simplified it. Some bare ground in there, but not much. I've taken out the houses because I think it's just too distracting. Not that you couldn't have them in there. You'd have to really reduce them as far as intensity and contrast so they don't draw your attention away from the focal point. Then I want more a lighter blue-green yet in the background. So taking somewhat the same color, maybe a bit more blue, and just add white to it. And that's going to make it recede back. When you add white to something, it does kill the color a little bit. You can see this is a little grayer here than here, which I want less intensity as I go back, a little lighter and cooler. Also added some of the lights, knowing that these will be grayer, not as saturated, more muted than the lights in the foreground. So everything's a comparison of foreground to background. And then lastly, you can see these dark accents in here, just pushing those to pull the foreground closer to the viewer. And that makes these areas look like they're receding and going back. Everywhere in the foreground, the trunks, darker, accents under the shrubbery, darker. They aren't very big darks, but they do pull that foreground forward. And then also the lights stronger, and I'm comparing them to the lights in the background. So the lights are going to be stronger, less white, not as much of the complement to gray it. This photograph has a lot less distance. The background, the foreground, there's some distance there, but not much, not compared to this. By using cooler blues, blue-greens, lighter darks, getting rid of some of the detail, because that is a big part of it. All this detail of the flat ground, buildings, little darks and lights, they do make those things more important and they come forward. But if we get rid of them and get cooler, lighter shapes back in there, you get a lot more distance. And also getting rid of detail, especially in the background, but also some in the foreground, helps also in creating more depth. Now this photograph, both of these are in New Mexico. What I want to do here now is, again, there's not as much distance back here. There's a distant mountain back in there, but it too close to the value of the sky. Everything gets kind of washed out. The greens up front here by the sheep, sunlit greens, are just as muted as the greens in the background. So I want to show some difference there, also making darks darker in the foreground. I would crop this first, getting rid of some of the stuff on the left side. So I'm going to crop it there, getting rid of a lot of the street. And in the painting, I would just pull the grass down and get rid of the road completely. First thing I want to do is create some distance back in here. These trees way in the background are too warm. Darks are too dark. There's too many varieties of colors in there, so simplify it and just pull it together. I made the mountain, the background bigger, plus a little darker. Could probably go a bit bluer in this background hill here. So I'm going to go a bit lighter and bluer. I think that's a better value in color. A little more intense. Muted some, but not very much. So now there's more difference between the background trees and then the further background mountains. And that creates, again, more depth. A lot bluer, a lot less detail, a lot less variation. Then in the middle ground grass there, I create a difference between the background. This is a yellow-green, could be cad yellow light and blue with some light alizarin crimson in it, so that it goes kind of muted. Still looks sunlit, but muted, very light. Here, around the sheep, the light grass is a lot stronger. More yellows, less white, and just comes forward a bit more. And that really helps to set up that flat plane, because there's a lot of flat plane in there, and I need to create some distance on there. Then in the foreground, just stronger colors. Here the greens are a bit muted for the foreground. Bit stronger, little variation of color. I got some purple and some gray reds, and just getting some more color in there. Also, trunks a little bit darker because they're in the foreground. I could probably go a bit darker than this, and adding some of the lights that are going to be real strong. Now, I didn't carry things very far as detail, but you can see the yellow-green here compared to the yellow-green in the background. Really pretty strong color, and that pulls that forward. And the darker accents on the tree trunk, could even get a few darker darks in and around the tree and around the sheep, and you can see how that dark accent really separates from the background, creates more depth. Now I don't like the edges. Edges are too hard. If I'm painting wet into wet, those dark accents will sink into it. But that goes a long way, those changes go a long way to create more depth on here. And like a lot of times, again, the photographs just don't pick up that depth. The better the camera, of course, you can create a bit more depth, but even then, it's a photographic representation, and it's just really lacking compared to what's there. So if I'm out photographing and I can't do a small color sketch, which I don't all the time, I might do one color sketch for every 200 photographs I take. But at least spend some time looking at it, thinking through the idea of what the colors are doing, maybe make some notes on a drawing. Spend more time than just pointing the camera and clicking it to kind of understand the value relationships and the distance in the foreground. I got a few paintings here. This is a painting by Guy Rose. You can see he really exaggerated the blues in the background. You don't see distant trees that blue. And he pushed that against the idea of the real strong yellows here, yellow greens, and more saturated greens in the foreground. You know, it might be a bit much with the strong greens in the foreground, and the blues might be too blue right here in kind of the middle of the ground, but the idea is there that he's created depth A lot of depth in there. This is a James Reynolds painting, and you can see the shadows in the background get more simple and they get bluer, less color, kind of a muted blue. Whereas in the foreground shadow, of course this is really dark, but you can see the difference between the real dark foreground shadow and the lighter, bluer background shadow. This background shadow looks pretty dark when you isolate it with the light on the mountains, but compared to the dark of the trees, this is a pretty light dark. And a little more detail in the foreground, stronger color. These yellow ochres, greens are a lot more saturated than the colors in the background. And the photographs will not always show that. This is another James Reynolds, and again the value change of the shadow in the background being bluer, a little more simple, a little lighter. Yeah, not so much. Some of these shadows in the middle ground are lighter than the background. But in general, there's nothing in these shadows in the background as dark as some of the accents in the shadows in the foreground. And then up front, you get really strong dark accents. And notice also the detail, or not detail, but broken up shape, more variation of bigger and smaller shape in the foreground, and detail compared to the background. Background very simple compared to the foreground. So those three things, value change, temperature change, and then detail change. Less detail, simpler in the background. One more here of a William Wendt. Again, you got the blue-greens in the background, and the stronger, more saturated oranges, red-orange in the foreground. And a lot more busy, more detail in the foreground, and background is a lot more simple. So contrast the busyness of background and foreground as well.